Today we're going to talk about a topic that's important to the company I work for and our customers, as well as really anyone in the cattle business, and that's maximizing carcass value and profitability. We're going to have that conversation in light of the current price environment. So let me describe that environment. Right now, cattle are worth a lot of money, and that includes all classes of cattle: fed cattle, feeder cattle, and cows. Over the years, there's been times where one category or another was pretty highly priced, but right now, really all of the cattle are worth a lot of money. And that changes some of the considerations in how we're going to manage them. And it's not just cattle, but it's also beef. And sometimes beef prices and cattle prices are dissociated a little, but right now, both cattle and beef are at high prices. Because beef is worth a lot of money, we have to make certain that we deliver what consumers are asking for if we ask them to pay those higher prices. Quality in particular, quality beef is worth a lot of money, but, and you see the ellipsis there at the end of that sentence, it's not worth money in the way that it has been historically. Right now, cattle have to grade 80 or 85% choice in order to get par for quality. That's sort of the table stakes for selling on a grid right now. But those premium grades, the certified Angus beef grades or prime carcasses, those are worth a tremendous amount of money. So the quality part is valuable too. Feed right now is not unusually high or low price. We would say feed is worth sort of a typical amount of money, although we're not that far removed from a time when feed was extremely high priced, which also changes our considerations in how we manage the cattle. But let's talk about some of the other inputs. Okay, labor in feed yards or in ranches is worth a lot of money now. Getting help is more expensive and harder than it's ever been, and that's something that we have to consider when we make our budgets and when we manage our businesses. And all of our other inputs, pickups, healthcare, the other things we have to buy are expensive now. And that changes our considerations, again, as we manage our cattle. And for the first time in a while, money is worth a lot of money. Okay, after an extended period of low interest rates where borrowing money didn't have a high cost, now we're at some more typical interest rates. And so as we manage our budgets and manage our businesses, we need to consider that borrowing money is going to have a cost higher than what we were used to recently. So what are we going to talk about today? We will cover two topics. One will be a little of the basic biology on how cattle grow. Understanding the changes at the end of the feeding period. It's really important to understand the biology in order to manage the business. And then once we understand that, we're going to talk about managing for carcass value and maximum profitability. And we're going to have some new terminology in there that we'll discuss as we go through. Okay, why am I showing you this picture? It's the easiest quiz ever. Okay, what is the question? Is that a feeder steer or a fed steer? Okay, now, the reason I can ask that is if you look, there are no identifying characteristics. There's no ladder or yardstick next to the steer. There's nothing we can really tell how tall or short he is based on any measurements we can see. But we all inherently know that that's a fed steer. Okay, he's 1,400 and some pounds. He was a yield grade 4.5. He was pretty fat, right? We know that by looking at the proportions, the shape, the smoothness. We know inherently, because we've looked at cattle our whole lives, that that's a fed steer, even though we can't really tell from the photo how big he is. Same with this one. Okay, that's a feeder steer. Okay, and we know that because we can see the sharp angles. We can see that there's a high percentage of bone and skeleton in this animal, this calf compared to the other one. We can see those differences that we've looked at our whole lives, and we know that this is a feeder steer who's light and thin. Okay, so here's the real question. That fed steer weighs about twice as much as the feeder. Is he twice as tall? No. Is he twice as long? No. Is he twice as wide? Yeah, he might be 3 times as wide. The point is, his proportion has changed as we fed. Okay? So let's talk about growth. An adult is not just a larger version of a baby. Okay? A fed steer or heifer is not just a larger version of a feeder. Growth is a process. It's a process like reproduction or healing or respiration or digestion, any of those other processes. Understanding that process is critical for efficient feeding and for managing for carcass value. Here's a chart we have to understand. Okay, this is a normal growth chart for most mammalian species would fit something like this. There's a couple of exceptions which are kind of fun to talk about, but for the most part, any mammal is going to have this kind of a growth curve. And if you look at the darker line, which is the total weight of the animal from birth to maturity, They grow slowly at first, then very rapidly. This would be around puberty, and then it slows down again. If you look at the three tissues we care most about in terms of carcass value, each of those has a different shape growth. Let's talk about bone or skeleton. Rapid at first, and then it slows down very dramatically to the point where at the end of a feeding period, very little skeletal growth is occurring. Muscle is the next one, and around that pubertal growth spurt, a lot of muscle growth happens. A lot of muscle is deposited in the carcass. A lot of the live weight gain of the animal at that stage of their life is muscle. But after a while, that will begin to plateau as they approach maturity. Okay? The third tissue that we care about is fat. And fat grows pretty slowly at the start. And if you think about that feeder calf we just saw, very little fat on that animal, some muscle, a lot of bone. But after a while, toward the end of a feeding period, when muscle slows down and bone growth has basically stopped, most of the weight gain is going to be fat. The fat is going to go increase dramatically, and a lot of the weight that they deposit at that stage will be fat. So this change in composition affects the efficiency of the animal. Here's an example, and on the axis here on the bottom, these numbers are kilograms, but it wouldn't matter if they were pounds or kilograms. As we go from light to heavy, the amount of protein per unit of weight gain goes down, or muscle, and the amount of fat per unit of weight gain goes up. And since fat has a lot more calories than protein or muscle, that means that the energy required to deposit that amount of weight gain gets higher. The animals become less efficient because they're gaining more fat and less protein or muscle. So at the end of a feeding period, there are some changes that affect live performance that we need to discuss and understand. One is that feed consumption, which will increase throughout most of the feeding period, will eventually plateau. And in some cases, if we feed the cattle a really long time, it may actually decrease at the end of a feeding period. The feed that they require for maintenance will increase throughout the whole time. Feed required for maintenance is proportional to the weight of the animal. And so as they weigh more, it takes more feed just to keep them alive and do the basic functions every day. That's a cost of maintenance for that animal. The energy content of the gain increases. That's because there's more fat and less muscle, and muscle has a high percentage of water. And so as we're gaining more weight in fat, it takes more calories to deposit that weight than if they're gaining muscle. The rate of live weight gain slows. If we weighed them every day, the average daily gain at the end of the feeding period would be lower than at the middle. Okay? And remember that sigmoidal growth curve we showed a moment ago where they grow rapidly for a while, and then after some period of time will flatten out a little bit. That's what happens in a feeding period. So feed conversion, if we measure it to live weight, the amount of feed required to put on a unit of live weight is going to become poorer because their gains are going to slow, the intake will stay about the same, and the composition of that gain's got more fat, less protein, so it takes more calories, therefore more feed. So that's what happens to live performance. What about carcass performance? These are the changes that occur at the end of a feeding period that affect carcass value. First, dressing percentage will increase, and we'll talk about that in a moment as to what that means, but that changes the economics dramatically of what happens at the end of a feeding period. It's something we really need to understand. The percentage of bone will decrease because that bone growth slows and the rest of the tissues grow more. Muscle weight will increase, but muscle percentage will decrease because it's going to be diluted by fat, because both the quantity and the percentage of carcass fat will increase. Carcass weight gain as a percentage of live weight gain increases. That's how the dressing percent goes up. Every unit of live weight gain will have an increasing amount of carcass weight attached to it as the animal gets more mature. And then marbling increases. We talked about fat in general terms, but the fat we care most about is marbling. That's the one that influences carcass value and the palatability of the product. So we want that fatness, and at the end of the conversation today we'll talk about can we get more marbling without more external fat, because that's something I think that would help the industry efficiency dramatically. So all of these things change. All of these changes are related, but they don't all happen at the same time or at the same pace. And so understanding those is really important to figure out the right time to market cattle and the right composition to sell them. So let's talk about growth again. Most growth of non-carcass tissues occurs before the cattle get to the feed yard. The nervous system, the brain, the eyeballs and spinal tract, those sorts of things are very well developed at birth. They don't get very much bigger as the animal gets bigger. Bone, we know, grows early in life, but then once we get cattle into a feed yard, bone growth slows quite a bit after they've been on feed for just a little while. The digestive tract may grow quite a bit before. That's influenced a little bit by what they're eating, so especially cattle on pasture will have a bigger, heavier digestive tract just because of what they're consuming. But once we get them to the feed yard, almost all of the growth is in carcass tissues, and most of that is muscle and fat. And that's what we need to manage. So as we put on an increasing amount of carcass weight per unit of live weight, the dressing percent's going to go up. Sometimes in experiments, we will harvest some cattle at the start to see what their initial composition was. We've done enough of that to know that feeder cattle are going to have a dressing percentage of somewhere in the 50s, okay? The rule of thumb I like to use, if they're 6 weights, it's about 52%. If they're 7 weights, it's about 55. If they're 8 or 9 weights, it may be 58. But it's much lower than what their ultimate dressing percentage will be at the end of the feeding period. And that increases in more or less a straight line as we feed them longer. So carcass weight is growing faster than non-carcass weight, or an increasing proportion of live weight is the carcass. About 75% of the weight that they gain in the feed yard is carcass weight, and the proportion increases steadily throughout that feeding period. Really important to understand that at the end of a typical feeding period, 85, sometimes even 90% of the weight that the animals are gaining is carcass weight. Here's what that would look like in a chart. If we bring in, say, a 600-pound animal, at that point, the carcass weight for that animal would be around 300 pounds with a dressing percent in the low 50s. The first 50 pounds of live weight gain from 6 to 650 would have about 31 pounds of carcass. The second 50 pounds would have about 32 pounds of carcass. The next 50 pounds would have more. And you can see as we get out to mature weights, the weights where we would harvest the cattle at a dressing percent of 64 or 65, now each 50 pounds additional has more than 40 pounds of carcass weight attached to it. In other words, the incremental dressing percent of that last 50 pounds of weight gain is somewhere around 85. It can be as high as 90% carcass weight. So while the live weight gain slows and the efficiency of feed conversion to live weight slows, the carcass weight deposition will generally stay on about the same pace, and the percentage of live weight that is carcass weight will get very high. So here's some rules of thumb that you can use. At the end of a feeding period, live weight gain is going to slow to about 80% of what the closeout average will be. So for ease of figuring, if we have a pen of steers that will have a closeout daily gain of 4 pounds a day, take 4 pounds times 80%, you'll get 3.2. The last few weeks that they're there, they're probably gaining about 3.2 pounds per day as part of a 4-pound feeding period. And of that 3.2, about 80% of the live weight gain is carcass, okay? So in the example here, here's how we do the math. Suppose we have steers that will close out at 3.75 pounds per day. 80% of that is 3 pounds. So at the end of the feeding period, those cattle would be gaining about 3 pounds a day. 2.4 pounds of that is carcass weight. So the question we have to ask, if we're deciding whether to market these cattle or not, is the daily cost, what they're eating, yardage, other interest, other costs, more or less than the value of 2.4 pounds of carcass? Okay? And for most of the last few decades, it's made sense to feed cattle longer. So here's how the industry has reacted. My friends at Elanco have a benchmark program where they collect data from a lot of feed yards across the country and allow me to summarize that occasionally. And here's some of their data for the last 22 years. If you look at on this, the horizontal axis is the year, so the first year is 2000. The most recent year I have here is 2022. I update this every other year. We'll update it again after 2024 is complete. But look what the steers have done. This black line is live weight or out weight of steers harvested. And it's gone up from about 1250 in 2000 to well over 1,400 pounds in 2022. And I can tell you that it's continued since then. The red line with the dots on it is heifers, and it's done more or less the same thing. If you look at this equation here, that factor of 9 there says that the average increase in weight for steers has been about 9 pounds a year for all 22 of those years. So we've made cattle a lot bigger. So as you would expect, carcass weight has done the same thing. So again, the black line is steer carcass weights. During this period of time, the average has gone from less than 800 pounds to over 900 pounds, with a slope of about 6 pounds per year increase in the steers and about 4.5 pounds per year increase in the heifers. So whether steers or heifers, we've made them bigger and we've got heavier carcasses than we used to have. That's a result of the industry understanding those changes at the end of the feeding period and that most of that live weight gain was carcass. We in the cattle business still talk more about live cost of gain, but I think it would help our businesses if we understood carcass cost of gain as well. And we also need to talk about the incremental cost of gain, and that's the cost of putting on the next pound today. So instead of thinking only about cost of gain for the entire feeding period, let's think about what are they doing today, and is it a good idea to feed them longer or not. If we're selling carcass weight, we need to pay attention to carcass cost of gain. The way this usually works is that profitability will increase until the incremental cost of gain exceeds the sale price. Okay, so it's not the cost of gain that's on a closeout that matters for today's decision. It's what their cost of gain would be today based on what they're eating and how fast they're growing. This is a calculator that we've built that our customers use that will give you a look at what happens if we were to feed cattle longer or shorter than the amount of time we expect it to. So the user can enter some inputs here, and in this box here is the targeted days on feed, what they expected in it, and you can see that at 10 or 20 days less, or 10, 20, or 30 days longer, how both the live performance, the carcass weight, and the financials would differ based on how long we feed them. Using a tool like this is really important to help understand what happens at the end of the feeding period and how long we should feed cattle. And what we usually see is something like this, that if we're selling live weight, profitability will go down because the cost continues to go up and the live weight gain slows. But if we're selling carcass weight, the profitability will increase with more days because of that increased dressing percent at the end of the feeding period. If you want to put that into a chart, sometimes pictures are easier to understand than numbers. This is what it would look like. This blue line would represent selling cattle live, where because the live weight gain slows and the intake stays high, their profitability will go down with more days. The red line would indicate selling on a carcass weight. So because of the increasing dressing percent, even though they're continuing to eat and gain, and their gain has slowed, their carcass weight gain has not slowed, and so their profitability in selling carcasses goes up with more days on feed. And here's an example using some typical cost and price inputs of what that looks like. If we were going to feed cattle for the first 165 days of a feeding period, these example or typical cattle would have a feed conversion of 5.85, which is very efficient, a cost gain of $108. If we feed them 10 more days, that 10-day increment has a conversion of 8.1 and a cost of $147. And the next 10 days is higher conversion and higher cost. If we look at it on a carcass basis, they would convert live weight, feed to carcass weight at a ratio of 8.19 for the first 165 days at a cost of $151. Now, if we think about carcass value at around $3 per pound, taking $151 to put on 100 pounds of carcass is still very, very profitable because that's $300 of carcass value we've created. And even as we increase more days on feed, the conversion of feed to carcass weight gets worse, just like it does in live weight, and the cost goes up, but it typically will not approach what the value of that gain is, and that's why we feed cattle longer. So to talk about this section, which is just weight gain only, here's the summary. As cattle grow in the feed yard, most of the weight gain is carcass tissues. It's muscle and it's fat. Early on in a feeding period, cattle are not fat enough to sell. As they increase in weight, they become more valuable because they add more fatness, they add more marbling, the carcasses increase in value. But if we feed them too long, they can get too heavy or too fat and lose value because of those discounts. As they're fed, feed intake and cost increases. And I have a comment here about NRC modeling, which we've done quite a bit of. It's more important, I think, to use your own data if you have enough of it, because every circumstance is a little different. I think it's important to do modeling with your own data and understand what your own cost and efficiencies are. And the right marketing date for a pen of cattle will maximize value over cost, and we'll use a dynamic model to integrate both. So that's weight only. Now let's talk about what the composition of that weight and the quality and the other determinants of price and value will be. Okay, so we're going to start with quality grade. And here's one of the great industry success stories. Okay, if we go back to 2000, about half the cattle graded choice. Okay, if you look at heifers at around 55% choice, steers at around 45, a weighted average was right around 50. And now the average quality grade in our industry is well past 80%, and it's gone up even since the last year in this chart. Okay, so we've gone from around half the cattle grading choice to nearly all of them. That was in response to the National Beef Quality Audits in around 2000 and a few of them earlier than that, telling us that people were dissatisfied with the eating experience of beef. And the way to make it better, the way to make it a more enjoyable eating experience was to get more marbling in it. And that's what we've done. So the change in genetics with the cattle and the change in feeding them longer into heavier weights has dramatically increased the percent choice and enhanced the eating experience for people that eat beef. And what that's done then is change the way that we sell the cattle. Okay, so selling cattle just on a cash basis has declined. We don't do as much of that as we used to. And selling on a formula basis or a grid where we price the carcasses individually and they're each valued based on their quality and yield grade and some other factors has increased dramatically. So as we've made the cattle higher quality, as we increase the eating experience and the eating enjoyment for people who eat beef, we've also changed the way that we market the cattle so that we can get paid for those quality factors. So let's look at that a little more in depth. So we said that around 80 to 85% of the cattle are grading choice. And if you look at the last 5 years in the database that I just showed you, here's the distribution. So the average of all those cattle would be around 85% choice. The most common grade, the highest point in this distribution, is in the 80s. So the most common quality grade for a pen of cattle would be somewhere in the 80s of 80% choice or 80 to 90% choice. The next most common would be in the 90s, and then the 70s and 60s and so forth. There's a very small proportion of cattle that grade only 30 or 40% choice. Those cattle have really been weeded out of our industry. We have very few of those. So that's all of the cattle. If we break them into steers and heifers, you see more or less the same thing. Heifers are going to have higher quality grade than steers. We have more 80 and 90% heifers than steers. We have a few more of the 40, 50, 60% choice steers than we do heifers. But for the most part, the shape of these curves is about the same, and the heifers are just skewed a little toward more fatness and higher quality. Now let's look at the individual quality grades. Okay, so we've taken out choice and select. As we go from 30 to 90% choice, as we feed cattle further or as we get higher quality cattle, look what happens to the other grades. So I've taken choice and select off of this chart so that we can magnify the other grades. This line is the penalty quality grades. Those would be standards or no rolls. And as we get toward 80 or 90% choice, those basically disappear. We have virtually none of those penalized quality grades as we get to 80 or 90% choice. The certified Angus beef proportion goes from pretty low at very low grading cattle to very high as we get out to 80 or 90% choice. And again, this is all cattle, so not all of them were even eligible to be CAB, but the percentage of CAB goes up dramatically. And look at the primes. The primes go from virtually zero, somewhere around 50 or 60% choice, we get a couple of percent prime. But look what they do here at the end of as we get to the really high grading cattle. That line slopes up pretty dramatically. Let's put a box on the right side of that. Okay? Since we know we have very few cattle grading 30 or 40 or even 50% anymore, most cattle grade more than 60% choice, and the most common grades are 70 or 80 or 90% choice. And let's look at what happens when we move cattle from 70 to 80 to 90% choice. At that point, the CABs basically double and the primes basically double. So even though we're getting maybe 20% more choice cattle, we're getting twice as many of the really high premium cattle, the CABs and the primes. So as we go from 70 to 90% choice, we add 20 percentage units of choice, but we had a really high proportion of the premium cattle. And that's where the money is, the way carcasses are marketed these days. Okay? So that's all great news. Okay? It's nice to know that as we get cattle fatter, as we feed them longer, as we get more quality, we get more of those really high quality grades. That's really important. Okay? But we also have to understand that not all of the things that happen at the end of the feeding period are good for carcass value. Okay? So let's remember the first rule of biology. Everything is connected to everything. As we make cattle fatter and get more quality, we also have more of the cattle that are too fat and are going to be penalized. Okay? Those are the yield grade 4s and 5s. So as you recall, the yield grading system has 5 grades, 1 through 5. 1 are lean and very muscular. 4s and 5s are the over fat cattle, especially the 5s. And here's how the proportion of those has changed going back to 2000. So remember in 2000, only about half the cattle graded choice. Now we had about 5% 4s and 5s. Now we're out here with 85% of the cattle grading choice, but we have 12, 14, 16% of them in the yield grade 4 and 5 category that are going to be penalized because they're over fat. And on the other end, the yield grade 1s and 2s, those that are lean and muscular and would get a premium, have declined during that period of time. So we've changed the genetics, we've changed the way we feed the cattle, we've changed the time and the endpoint that we feed them to. We've got more quality, but we've also got more penalized carcasses because of fatness, and fewer that are going to get the premium because they're lean and muscular. And if you look at that, if we sort the carcasses into categories from the lowest grading cattle to the highest grading cattle, as you would expect, the average yield grade increases as we go to higher grading cattle. So everything is connected to everything. We get more external fatness because we want to get more internal fatness or marbling, and so we have these higher, less desirable yield grades. And here's what that looks like as a table. These are the quality grades. If we go from 0, which basically never happens, up to 100% choice, the primes go from very low to high, the premium cattle go up, the choice go up, the select goes down, the penalty goes down. That's just the numbers behind the chart I showed you a moment ago. Now we've added in the yield grades too. Okay, so the numbers in the top half of this chart are the same that we showed just a second ago. These are the yield grades, and so you can see that yield grade 1s drop dramatically as we increase with quality grade. Yield grade 4s and 5s go up pretty dramatically, and that's what happens as we make the cattle fatter. We're going to get more of the penalty quality grades and fewer of the premium quality grades. And we really don't need to look at the left half of this chart because we have very few cattle that are in those categories. But it's still instructive to see over here as we go from 60 to 100% choice that the prime cattle go up by a factor of 4, 5, 6 sometimes. The yield grade 1s drop to almost none. The yield grade 4s and 5s go up again by a factor of 3 or 4 or 5. So let's talk about the way carcass value changes over time as we feed cattle longer. First, the quality grade profile improves. We will get more marbling. We'll get more cattle move from penalty or select up to choice, more cattle move from choice into a premium quality grade or to prime. But the yield grade profile also becomes poorer. Okay? More of the 1s turn into 2s, the 2s turn into 3s, the 4s and 5s appear, and at the end of the feeding period, as we've got a lot of quality and marbling, we're going to have a lot of extra fat cattle too. Weight discounts will increase. We're going to get more cattle that are above whatever threshold our grid tells us is too big, and some of the cattle are going to topple over that and be discounted. So if you think about this, it's really complicated to come up with the right marketing plan, because on any given day, some individual animals are becoming more valuable, some are becoming less valuable. The value of the entire group is maybe increasing or decreasing, but it's always changing, and we've got to find the right time to market those cattle. The most common thing that happens is the value of the cattle will increase as weight is added until the penalties for either heavies or yield grade 4s accumulate, and value then decreases rapidly. Let's draw a picture of that. Okay? So this red line is the same one I showed you a few moments ago, that if we're selling carcass weight only, as we add more days, profitability will increase because of that increased dressing percentage and the increased proportion of live weight that is carcass. If we sell on a grid, we're going to get really poor price early on because they won't be fat enough, they won't have enough quality. That price will go up. Okay? The potential price should exceed what we could get on just a weight only basis because we should get paid for quality at a certain point, but we have to be careful because as we get too many heavies or 4s, that can dip below because those discounts accumulate at the end of a feeding period. Okay? So we have more opportunity when we sell on a grid, but we also have a responsibility to avoid selling them too early or too late and missing out and getting penalized. And here's what that looks like if we use some standard premiums or discounts, $30 for prime and 6 for CABs and so on and so forth. And you can see some typical premiums for yield grade 1s and 2s and discounts for 4s and 5s. As we go from very low grading cattle, which shouldn't be sold on a grid, to very high grading cattle, you can see that the benefit of the prime cattle in dollars per hundred increases, the benefit of the CABs increase, the choice increases, the select decreases because we have fewer of them, the penalty quality grades go away. You can see the same thing changes in yield grades, that the value of those 1s diminish because there are fewer of them. The discount that the 4s and 5s bring increases. If you look down here in the net for quality grade goes from really terrible at 30 or 40% choice. We would never want to sell a cattle like that on a grid, okay? To very favorable, up to as much as $10 or $12 per hundred for the really high grading cattle based on quality grade only. Then the yield grade premiums and discounts go in the opposite direction. They'll be high on low grading cattle because there'll be a lot of 1s and 2s, and then they'll diminish and actually become negative as we get out to the highest grading cattle because there'll be some yield grade 4s and 5s there. Okay? If you combine these two, the one that does the most driving is the quality grade premium or discount. That's by far bigger than the yield grade premium or discount. And so we see in this bottom row here, 30 or 40% choice cattle would be well below the market. They shouldn't be sold that way. We don't want to feed them. We don't want to have those. But we get out into the highest grading cattle. There's opportunity for some really nice grid premiums if we've got cattle that can grade 80 or 90% choice. So if we're talking about selling on a grid, what creates real value? Let's look at the dollars of impact on 100 head of cattle. Okay? If we increase from 60 to 70% choice, and this again depends on the assumptions in terms of pricing and so forth, but in typical conditions, that's going to add about $2,000 to a set of 100 cattle, about 20 bucks per head. If we go from 70 to 80% choice, that adds even more, about $2,150. Now, why is this number higher than that one? Because I've included here not just the 10% units of choice, okay, but also the premium quality grades that might come with that and a reduction in the discounted quality grades that would happen, okay? So from 60 to 70 is valuable, from 70 to 80 is even more valuable, from 80 to 90 is even more valuable than that, because at that point we're out in that outer end where we're going to get a lot of premium choice cattle and a lot of prime cattle, so that's worth $2,300. If we go from 90 to 100% choice, we get more quality value, but now we're probably going to get some discounts on 4s and heavies, and so it's still a valuable increase, but not more so than the previous ones, okay? So if we increase premium choice by 10% units, that's worth $1,700 using typical pricing conditions. If we increase prime by only 5%, that's worth $1,350, okay? So these are very valuable, very big increases in value that we can add to pen of cattle at the end of the feeding period by feeding them longer and getting them into 10 or 20% units more choice, okay? If you compare that to what yield grades do, the impact is much, much less. Suppose we create a feeding program where we increase the yield grade 2s by 10% units, that's worth $180. That's nice to have, but it pretty well pales in comparison to what these quality premiums can do. So just one more reminder that when we're marketing cattle on a grid, we've got to get the quality into them because that's where the money is. And if we give up a little on yield grade, maybe sting a little bit, but it won't be nearly as impactful as those high quality grades. Then there are some other categories that we need to understand if we sell on a grid. One of the points that I think is really important, if you're going to sell average quality cattle on a grid, you need to get better than average money. Okay, now that seems odd. If you sell average cattle, shouldn't you get average money? No, you should get more. And here's why. Because the risk transfer from the packer to the feeder, to the owner of the cattle, is pretty substantial. The feeder is taking more risk selling on a grid than the packer does, because the packer is just paying for the actual value of what the cattle do. So if you're going to accept that risk, you need to get somewhat of a premium for cattle that are average. Then you want to sell cattle that are better than average and get a really nice premium. That's what you want to do on a grid. You have to be aware of some of the things that can really destroy value. One example is light carcasses. Okay? Most grids have a minimum weight below which they'll be discounted pretty substantially. They have a maximum weight too, and the heavies and the discount per unit of 100 pounds may be about the same for lights and heavies, but the heavies are more impactful just because they have more units of weight. So a $30 discount times a 550-pound carcass is $165. A 30-pound discount times a 1,000-pound carcass is $300. So we want to avoid lights. They're not really much of a problem anymore because our cattle are big enough that we don't have that issue. But we're also seeing some grids now increase the weight at which they would penalize lights, and so that's coming back into focus a little bit. We've also seen most grids become more lenient with regard to heavies, and so the heavy discounts are not as common, and they start at heavier weights than they used to. So heavies are still a challenge, but not as negatively impactful as they used to be. The penalty quality grades, those that are over 30 months or dark cutters, those are rare occurrences, but they're really, really expensive and impactful. So we need to make sure that we know what we're feeding and we can manage around those things and try to minimize those penalty carcasses. Now, one thing we can do is sort cattle to make a more uniform group. And if we do that, we can shift the average weight. Okay, so this wide distribution here is an unsorted population, and typically that would mean a standard deviation of about 100 pounds within any of carcass weight within any pen of cattle. We've shown that we can decrease that standard deviation to about 60 pounds with a single sort, depending on when we do that. That lets us shift the mean upward, add more weight, and still have the same proportion of cattle that are in the really heavy categories that might be penalized. So if we want to add more weight and do it without incurring heavy penalties, sorting is one of the ways to do that. As the grids have become more lenient with regard to heavies, that's become less economically important than it was maybe 10 or 12 years ago, but it's still a tool that we have in our toolbox. And this tells us really what we need to know about selling cattle and the options that we have. These are data from my friends at CattleFax who show that if you go back from 2012 to the most recent full year that they have, cattle at grade less than 35% choice are going to be negative, where 0 here would mean average, okay? Cattle that are lower grading cattle are going to maybe make a little bit, but the higher grading cattle, especially those that are over 80% choice, have made nice premiums over the last decade or two. And so when we buy cattle and we do a break even, we see that the industry can be kind of a zero-sum game if we are cash feeder cattle, cash fed cattle, and cash corn for the whole time. But if we have opportunity, if we have high quality cattle and we have opportunity to sell them on a grid where we can recognize that value, even in a break-even business, we can get premiums of $60, $70, $80 per head if we've got the right quality and the right way to market those. So that's a lot of charts and a lot of numbers. The point here is there's no way that you can do all of that in your head, and even the smartest people can't just eyeball the cattle and know. We've got to do some modeling. We've got to have data. We've got to look at, use the sorts of calculators that we and others have built to help our customers make better decisions. Because we can't look at all the cattle and know everything, all the changes that are happening. We know that intake and feed conversion are changing constantly. The market is moving and maybe there's a blizzard on the way, okay? We need to be able to accurately predict outcomes and optimize profitability. I'm telling you right now, we use spreadsheets and calculators that we build. Those are great. There's even better stuff coming, okay? The machine learning, the artificial intelligence that we're going to be able to apply to the sort of data that we have is really going to help us make even better decisions in the future. So stay on top of this and keep learning. Well, what's next? I'm going to give you 2 opinions, 1 fact, and a question, okay? An opinion, continuing to increase marbling would be a good thing. If you think about changing cattle from 50 to 80 or 90% choice over the last 20 years has really enhanced the eating experience. It's reduced the number of dissatisfied eating experiences. It allows us, because we have a better tasting product, because we've got God's favorite creature with the extra gene for deliciousness, and we feed them to a point where they taste good, we can charge much more than the other proteins, okay? The value of a pound of beef is much higher than pork or poultry, because it's a better eating experience. People are willing to pay more. My opinion is continuing to do that would be a good thing. A fact is that fat is expensive to put on, okay? An opinion is that continuing to increase external fatness would be a bad thing. And so here's a question. Can we get more marbling without increasing the external fat? Let's dive just a little bit into how much that external fat costs us. Here's a regression equation from some experimental data from South Dakota State where Dr. Pritchard looked at feed conversion on this axis of feeding to different yield grades. And what you see is if we sell them at really lean, muscular, low yield grades, they're very efficient. But that line goes up pretty dramatically as we feed them to fatter endpoints, okay? This we inherently know, and we appreciate Dr. Pritchard quantifying that so we can do the math on that. But as we make them fatter, they're going to be less efficient. So these are slides from, or a photo from the USDA training materials. So this is the marbling in a select carcass. This is a choice, this is a prime. And you can see there's lots more marbling, those little flecks of fat inside there. These 3 steaks were trimmed to have the same amount of external fat. But in reality, most of these would be pretty lean, most of those would be pretty fat, okay? The real question is, where's most of the fat on the carcass? It's not the marbling. Okay? There's not, as far as the proportion of fat in the carcass, marbling is a pretty small amount. It's that external fat and some other fat depots where most of the fat is. Can we get more marbling without getting more external fat? if we could get more of this without getting more of this, okay, we could improve the quality without really changing the efficiency negatively. That's where we want to go. And the point is, we can. Okay? I know we can do it because we've done something similar in the past. Okay? So, note that this chart ends in 1991. This is Angus genetic trend for yearling weight and birth weight. Why am I showing you that? Because in the 70s, the Angus breed and the cattle population in general had a problem that needed to be solved. Cattle were not big enough, they didn't grow fast enough. We needed more performance in the cattle. Okay? And the Angus breed did that, as did others. Okay? As you can see, for this 20-some year period, the genetic trend for birth weight, which is the blue line, and yearling weight, which is this gold line, were more or less the same. We got more of one and we got more of the other. You would expect that. These are correlated traits. When we select for yearling weight, when we select to get more performance, we're likely going to get more birth weight. But about that time, the industry recognized that we had to put a lid on birth weight. There were some birth weights that were going to be too high. We needed to get more yearling weight without getting more birth weight. And because we had expected progeny differences, because we finally had genetic tools that could let us get more of one trait without more of a correlated trait, we were able to do that. And so this chart is the same one but continued up to the current day. And the arrow there is where the chart ended just a moment ago. So you can see that birth weight went up, but since that point, yearling weight has continued to go up. Okay, so we've had a more or less straight line in yearling weight. We've continued to get more and more and more performance without more birth weight, because the genetic selection tools we have now allow us to get more of this thing that we want without getting more of this correlated trait that we don't want. Okay, well, why did I show you all of that? Because we have to do the same thing with fatness. Here's the genetic trend for marbling, ribeye, and fat thickness, and you can see during this period of time they've all gone up. Okay, so the cattle are fatter, they've got more marbling, they're more muscular too. All of those things have changed in unison. We've basically selected for marbling, we visually selected for more muscular cattle, and we've got those, but we also got more external fat, which is the fat that doesn't help palatability and does decrease our efficiency. So we've got more of the thing we wanted, but because it's correlated and we didn't really select against it, we also got more of the thing we don't want. Okay? We need to change that. We need to continue to select for marbling, but make certain that we don't get more external fat. And here's why. If we did the calculations using the net energy equations, if we feed cattle from a yield grade 3 to a yield grade 4, it's going to take 247 pounds of corn to do that. Okay? If we could get only marbling without any external fat, if we could get more marbling without making the cattle fatter, we could go from low choice to premium with only 13 pounds of corn required. Okay? 13 pounds of corn at 10, 11, 12 cents a pound, that's $1.50. Okay? We could get cattle from low choice to premium for $1.50, or from premium to prime for $3. Okay? If we can do that without all of this money, all of this corn wasted to make the cattle fatter, if we could only get marbling, if we could select specifically for marbling without external fat, it would be almost free in terms of cattle economics. And my thanks to Esther Tarpoff of the Angus Association for sending me these data, because this is proof that we can do that. Proof that that can happen. Okay? Each dot on here represents a single non-parent bull in the most recent year. Okay? So all of those are all the young bulls that were registered. Okay? Except these are only those that are in the top 25% of marbling EPD. So these are the best genetics within the breed for marbling. Okay? The best 25% for marbling. And this 0 would indicate exactly average external fat. Okay? So all of these dots down here represent bulls that are high marbling and less than average in terms of external fatness. Those are the bulls we can select from to get more marbling without getting more external fat, maybe even less. Okay? If you put a box around them, those are the ones, all of those dots, however many that is, those are the dots that we can select from and get more marbling and get either the same or less fatness. Now, don't know about milk or scrotal circumference or any of the other things we need, but we assume that with that many dots to pick from, that there are some bulls that can meet our needs. So let's summarize. As cattle grow in the feed yard, most of the weight gain is carcass tissues, that's muscle and fat. And early on, cattle are not fat enough to sell. As they increase in weight, they become more valuable. If they're fed too long, they can get too heavy or too fat and lose value. So as they're fed, feed intake and cost increases, but the increase in dressing percentage usually makes more days beneficial if we're selling carcass weight or on a grid. The right marketing date maximizes value over cost and uses a dynamic model to integrate both. Because of the incremental dressing percentage that we talked about, which is generally 80% or even higher, late days are typically profitable for carcass sellers. Putting more weight on helps someone selling a carcasses in ways that it wouldn't help someone selling live weight. That's true until discounts are incurred or unless feed is very, very expensive. We also have to consider, is this one that's standing there more or less profitable than a more efficient replacement animal that we could buy? Okay? So we have to consider all those things. To do that, we need to build carcass value change models that are based on the specific grid that you have access to, that you may be marketing into. You need to consider the incremental revenue and cost. You need to compare to the swap opportunity. We need to look at profitability per head space in a feed yard rather than per head and consider both. Okay. That makes the math pretty complicated. That means you got to build models. It means you got to really put some effort into this, but the payoffs can be very, very substantial. Let's also remember our business partner, our packer or brand or whoever is selling the beef and buying the cattle is going to have some input too, and we need to help to deliver to them what's most valuable for them. Okay, so these are all of the different considerations. It's complex, but there's a great deal of opportunity if we get it right.